Everybody is now muted pretty much. And the transcription, as I say, if you can see that and you don't want to, you should be able to kind of minimize that. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Charlotte Taylor Suppé. And Charlotte completed her PhD at King's College London. Her presentation today is drawn from a very exciting forthcoming book on Virginia Woolf and motherhood, which is coming out from Edinburgh University Press. I'm very excited for it, and I think we all should be keeping an eye out for it. Her research focuses on the way in which women authors write about motherhood. She uses a historicist approach to examine how maternal discourses and characters reflect important events and shifts in politics and culture, and she has a particular interest in early 20th century texts. So the title for her paper today is Women Must Weep, Betty Flanders and the Perils of Nationalistic Mothering. Charlotte, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Alice. Can everybody hear me? Yes, thumbs up. Great. Excellent. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. So my paper today is an examination of the character of Betty Flanders and how militarism and motherhood are connected in Jacob's Room. Links between motherhood and war can be found throughout much of Virginia Woolf's account. While Woolf's contribution to war literature has earned academic attention.
Ja, met moeite, maar het lukt.
Everyone wants to check that they're muted. While Woolf's contribution to war literature has earned well-merited academic attention, little has been written on how and why she used motherhood as a lens through which to investigate and condemn both war and war-making society. Today in Britain, stay-at-home mothers are rarely heralded as beneficial to nation and economy. Indeed, current government policy providing free childcare starting at 3 would suggest that the priority is getting women back into the workforce. How things have changed in a century. During the First World War, the British public were to think of motherhood as the primary purpose of womanhood. This message radiated from government-sponsored posters, social policy, the mainstream media and pamphleteers, with both pro and anti-war factions finding a unifying message in the figure of an archetypal mother. The effect of all of this rhetoric was such that many public discussions concerning women's affairs, from their alcohol consumption to their military involvement, were framed as questions of motherhood. Woolf, as a pacifist, hated the nationalistic promotion of war. She also criticised the idealistic representations of women that were part and parcel of wartime rhetoric. As a childless woman, Woolf was particularly sensitive to the types of matriarchal images that the press used to manipulate their readers, and as motherhood became a popular way for the media to speak about wartime femininity, so it became an effective way for Woolf as a woman to speak about war. In her unique style, she made parodies of the ideal mother created by the media, and Betty Flanders, the maternal figure in Jacob's Room, is a fine example of this satire. Jacob's Room is not often noted for its portrayal of motherhood. Woolf's stunning formal innovations using absences within the narrative to construct the evasive magnetism of a brilliant lost youth may be the reason that academics have overlooked the tragicomic influence of Jacob's mother Betty. Jacob's characteristic intangibility is counterbalanced by Betty's cartoonish description, and she is far more than a mildly sketched character, for her parenting influences directly influence his tragic fate. But Betty's presence in the early chapters of Jacob's Room highlights one of the most fundamental ways society molds young men into soldiers. As an archetypal war mother, Betty nurtures her boy children for the benefit of the empire, readying them for soldierhood and sacrifice. By providing Jacob with an upbringing rich in the patriarchal values of competition and violence, she becomes, at least in part, culpable for his death. We can be sure Woolf intended Betty to be a central part of the novel because the narrative both begins and ends with her image. Even the name Jacob's Room evokes a formative space such as the room a young boy occupies in his parents' house. Betty both embraces and embodies nationalism and patriarchy, internalizing violent ideals that were abhorrent to Woolf. She raises her sons by soothing and occupying them with bloody stories, such as the gunpowder explosion in which poor Mr. Curnow lost his eye. Betty also nurtures her son's fledgling bravado. One incident sees Archer, her eldest, proffering a knife to protect her from a belligerent rooster. Taking the knife, quote, to please him, Betty encourages Archer's aggressive instincts with the rather overt double entendre, "What a big knife for a small boy." Her message is clear. Not only should boys play with knives, but a bigger knife is always better. Spurred on by their mother's principles and rewarded by her admiration, the Flanders boys learn stereotypes that will aid them on their path to war, a path which one of Woolf's heroes, the anthropologist Jane Harrison, described as the outcome of our whole education, our public school system. In Jacob's Room, Woolf implies that this male-centric education system, whose principles and chauvinism she would grapple with her whole life, begins in Jacob's first room, with his mother telling him bedtime stories. To Betty's credit, she is aware all the time in the depths of her mind of some buried discomfort. But her moments of unease are overridden by a curious mix of powerlessness and a devotion to the patriarchal. A liminal figure within an entrenched social system, the widow Betty is overwhelmed by how helpless she is. She has no husband to support her, no inheritance, and the only man she might look to for support, her brother Morty, is missing. Woolf includes a biblical allusion to the Old Testament book of Ruth to give a historical context to Betty's lack of autonomy. Like Betty, Ruth is a widow who has little in the way of security until Boaz, a member of her mother-in-law's family, claims her. Boaz seeks to marry Ruth out of a mixture of love, responsibility, pity, and respect. But in order to make this legal, she must be traded between male relations as an adjunct to a piece of land. Boaz's rights to Ruth are symbolized by the handing over of a worn sandal, and she sleeps at his feet to show subjugation. Despite this reference, when her boys are still infants, Woolf does grant Betty a significant measure of autonomy by giving her a choice of two very different love interests. Betty's choice of partner is particularly important in her parenting and showing her values and affecting the way she raises her sons. Betty's first suitor is a gentle local clergyman named Mr. Floyd. Mr. Floyd's various traits betray him as a liberal intellectual. Like Woolf, he loves the classics and poetry. Intriguingly, Mr. Floyd's mother and Betty are friends. Thus, choosing her as the object of his affection suggests that he both likes and respects his mother's opinion. For her part, Betty is horrified by the idea of marrying a man with such matriarchal propensities. When she rejects him, Betty reveals a vicious streak, joyfully castrating his cat as a metaphor for emasculating the man himself. Mr. Floyd's romantic rival is a retired naval captain called Barfoot. An archetypal military man, Barfoot is a source of law and order. Woolf doesn't mince her words when she suggests that men like the captain are responsible for the Great War itself, with one of the more perceptive female characters noting of Barfoot, "It's the man's stupidity that's the cause of this, and the storm's my storm as well as his." While Woolf goes to some lengths to show Barfoot as a representative of her least favourite aspect of militarised patriarchal Britain, Betty Flanders, the novel notes, thought nothing of the kind. Barfoot's brutishness only serves to make Betty feel more feminine and desirable. Indeed, the novel describes how the attentions of the captain all ripened Betty Flanders, enlarged her figure, tinged her face with jollity, and flooded her eyes for no reason that anyone could see, perhaps 3 times a day. In response to her lover, Betty wears the traditional features of a fertile maid, a blushed cheek, quick emotions, and the ability to ripen or grow like so much fecund fruit. 'Tis significant that, despite her age, Betty's relationship with the captain enables her to maintain her social status as a sexual object. In his company, she becomes relevant, restored to the sexual and reproductive prime of a patriarchal stereotype. Woolf understood that during war, mothers accessed their citizenship through their wombs. She also perceived how much they lost by doing so. In the first draft of Jacob's Room, Betty glances at one of her sons and is afforded the sentiment, "I'm younger than I thought," and sorrow and pride too. As the most valuable woman in a patriarchal country is the one who gives birth to soldiers, Betty's fertility is bittersweet, signifying both fulfilment and loss. It is important to note that Barfoot is already married, but he is interested in his relationship with Betty because his wife is an invalid and they are without children. As the ladies of Scarborough point out, a man likes to have a son. Together with Betty, they raise her boys in his image, collaborating on their education and career choices. By selecting the captain as a role model for her boys rather than Mr. Floyd, Betty shows herself not as a passive voice, but an engaged advocate of war. Under the guidance of Captain Barfoot, Jacob matures into a certain type of man, a very different man to the one he would have become under Mr. Floyd. These two Jacobs are worlds apart, a fact impressed upon the reader when the adult Jacob is sighted by Mr. Floyd in the street, and he was so tall, so unconscious, such a fine young fellow, that Mr. Floyd did not like to stop him. This meeting is described twice in the novel, once near the beginning when Betty must choose between Mr. Floyd and the captain, and once a few pages before the end, when Jacob's fate is already sealed. In such a sparingly sketched novel, an image portrayed twice must warrant special attention. The moment is significant because it is the choice that forms Jacob as a man, and while it's not possible to say that his individual fate would have been different with Mr. Floyd, a world comprised of Mr. Floyds might make war itself obsolete. Another indication for Betty's proclivity for macho role models can be observed in the description of her late husband Seabrook's grave. Despite her poverty, Betty has given Seabrook a lavish old-fashioned burial with an expensive triple-sealed casket. She has also chosen an inaccurate epitaph for his tombstone, "Merchant of this city," even though in life Seabrook had, quote, "only sat behind an office window for 3 months, and before that had broken horses, ridden to hounds, farmed a few fields, and run a little wild." By reimagining him as a man of industry, part of the patriarchal order, Betty shows her desire for her sons to follow in the same path. His memory is an example for the boys. Mr. Flanders' lavish coffin and false epitaph are also perturbing when compared to the final resting place of his soldier sons and their comrades, young men who frequently fell unmarked in the mud or were left in mass graves. Indeed, Woolf had been writing Jacob's Room for 4 months when, on Armistice Day 1920, the unknown warrior was interred in his tomb in Westminster Abbey. This commemoration for lost soldiers, planned as an act of pro-war canonisation, was realised with a large dose of pomp and ceremony. Woolf's diary registers her horror and sadness over the event. It isn't the idea of remembrance that jarred her. Jacob's Room is, after all, an attempt at a new form of eulogy, but the obscene misuse of a generation of young men whose tragic and unnecessary loss was being perverted to promote nationalism and militarism. Woolf created Seabrook's grave with its extravagant casket and dishonest inscription to undermine such acts of ceremonious memorial, while simultaneously condemning Betty's maternal impulses in fashioning such a grave. This can be tied to another element of Armistice Day that disturbed Woolf, the inclusion of a vast number of females in the memorial services. Susan Grazel explains how the image of the grieving mother became a potent vehicle for the expression of collective memory and sorrow. Mother figures were frequently included on war memorials and found a place in the public eye, conspicuously crying at memorial unveilings and writing proud letters to newspapers about their hero sons. This figure was beneficial to the government and media, who wanted to glorify the war and reinforce women's place within the home. During the war, many women experienced independence and fiscal security for the first time, taking up roles traditionally filled by men. As peace returned and they were required to go back to their limited pre-war roles, there was an attempt to strengthen Victorian ideals and recall women to domesticity. Jessica Meyer has pointed out that returning soldiers were seen to be brutalized and emasculated by the trauma of fighting, and that it was believed there would be difficulties, as she writes, reintegrating men returning from war into anything other than a traditional understanding of gender, that where they would be neither threatened nor threaten women. Woolf noted the inconsistencies inherent in asking women to work and then taking this liberty away once the war was over. In 3 Guineas, her daughters of educated men ask why being women and having to give birth did not incapacitate us from working in Whitehall, in fields and factories when our country was in danger, to which their fathers replied, "The war is over. We are in England now." The interring of the unknown warrior was the ultimate expression of public mourning, and it was with an awareness of the effect it would make that the Cabinet Memorial Services Committee, the government panel set up to plan the day, exclusively invited women, mourning wives and mothers to make up the non-military portion of the Westminster Abbey congregation. Woolf recorded the event in her diary, recalling a lurid scene like one in hell. Women crying, "Remember the glorious dead," and holding out chrysanthemums. Recognising the manipulative quality of the occasion, she sought to undermine such governmental propaganda. In Jacob's room, Betty's tears over her husband's grave are exposed as flawed and human, subject to whimsical emotions and the need to provide a paternal role model, no matter how fictitious. The image of mourning woman is also revisited later in the novel when Betty is confronted by Jacob's death. In this moment, her bewilderment reveals the chaos of grief. Unlike the archetypal mourning mother represented by the press, whose loss is as impersonal as an unknown soldier, Betty worries about the mess and what to do with Jacob's shoes. In Jacob's room, Betty raises her sons to become the fathers of families and directors of banks. Jacob never develops into a fully formed patriarchy, but his untimely death, indeed his very desire to go to war in the first place, damns such war-centric mothering. This is why Jacob's room's depiction of mothering offers such valuable material for study. It is a reflection of Woolf's state of mind during those important years when she honed her craft and developed her unique style. As noted earlier, Woolf was childless at the time of the war and would remain so, a decision taken to protect her health, made with her husband Leonard and her doctors. Putting Woolf's mental well-being and her physical suitability aside, it's ambiguous whether she actually wanted children. She seemed to have planned for them, telling Leonard during their courtship that she wanted everything: love, children, adventure, intimacy, work. She was also rather pleased to receive a crib as a premature wedding present. However, there is evidence in her earliest writing to suggest that she also felt having children could grievously harm a female artist's ability to work, and seemed anxious that marriage and motherhood would ruin her dream of being a great writer. There is no denying that she was terribly jealous of her sister Vanessa, who had 3 children and was a model of effortless femininity. The profound feelings of wretchedness that this provoked was at the root of Woolf's heightened awareness of the maternal archetypes paraded before the public during the Great War. At a time when Woolf's loathing of the government and press, who she would later refer to as our prostituted fact purveyors, reached a peak. Though Woolf carried these sometimes painful associations between war and motherhood until the end of her life, she had reason to hope that society could be unburdened from its warlike tendencies in the same manner that she survived not having children. In the essay Thoughts on Peace in an Air Raid, written during World War II and at the end of Woolf's life, she seeks to free man from his aggressive instincts and counsels, "We must create more honourable activities for those who try to conquer in themselves their fighting instinct. We must give him access to the creative feelings." In much the same way, Woolf felt women could be released from their need to bear children, believing her art had gone some way towards relieving her own maternal drive. This did not always make her happy. In 1925, she confided to a friend that these efforts of mine to communicate with people are partly childlessness and the horror that sometimes overcomes me. But as she grew older, it satisfied her more and more, until she recorded in her diary in 1930 how elated writing could make her feel, describing a day of intoxication when I said, "Children are nothing compared to this." Whether she found it distressing, liberating, or a mixture of both, having no children affected the way Woolf processed the world around her. Her child-free existence led her work to be populated with mother figures, reflecting an area of contemporary society to which she was markedly sensitive. Although in January 1919 she wrote, "The history of war is not and never will be written from our point of view," in the following years she was compelled to write her own histories in earnest, in order to comment on what she had seen as a domestic female witness to war, and she populated these works with mother figures like Betty Flanders.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Charlotte, for that. That was really fascinating. Wonderful paper. Thank you. I'd like to now ask Chris Wells, if you'd like to share your slides.
Yeah.
And
can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yeah, we'll bring you in to share your presentation.
Yeah.
Fabulous. And as you're doing that, I'll just introduce you. So our second speaker today is Chris Wells. Chris is a second-year PhD student at the School of English at Sheffield University, and his research focuses on bisexuality in modernist literature, and he's published articles on James Joyce, Virginia Woolf, and sociological research on ageing and bisexuality in later life. And his presentation for us today is called Sexology, Bisexuality and Experimentation in Jacob's Room. And we can't see your slides up at the moment. I'm not sure whether you're already sharing or they're to come.
Oh wait, if I actually press the share button, it might actually work. So
that might be the one.
Start. Yeah. There's your experimentation.
These things are tricky. That's perfect. We've got it.
No, can you see that now? Brill, can you see that?
Yes. Yes.
Cool. Right.
We've got it. Thank you. When you're ready.
Yeah. Thank you everyone for having me. I'll start the paper. So, the title of my talk is Jacob's Room, Bisexuality and Experimental Narrative Form. And by means of an intro, as we read Jacob's Room as a Bildungsroman, we're always asking if we're often only privy to partial views, which are symbolically framed in chapter 10 as Fanny lights the lamp and, quote, only half was lit up by the lamp. And it's my argument and my contention that this sense of a partial view also applies to sexuality and how Woolf approached sexuality. In the work of both Havelock Ellis and Sigmund Freud, bisexuality, that is, for needs of defining it at this point, the erotic attraction of both men and women as objects of desire within a stable, ontological, anchored subject, which caused endless frustration and what Ellis admitted was, quote, too much uncertainty and doubt, close quote. Freud later admitted in his work in 1939 that the subject of bisexuality, quote, it embarrasses all of our inquiries into the subject. As Brenda Helt has demonstrated, the term bisexuality was a, quote, floating signifier because it was an overdetermined and overloaded descriptor with multiple meanings. Many sexologists overburdened this label of bisexuality with a discursive and discordant mosaic of identities, states of desire and psychological conditions which helped very usefully explicate as, quote, the conflation of concepts now understood as distinct, which are biological sex, gender, desire, sexual preference, sexual identity, and intellectual and artistic superiority. Now, in January 1920, Woolf writes in her diary that some idea of a new form for a novel. Suppose one thing should open out of another, as in an unwritten novel, not only for 10 pages, but 200 or so. Mark on the wall, Kew Gardens, and an unwritten novel, taking hands and dancing in unity. That's a quote from Woolf in her diary. And what's interesting to me is Woolf's desire for both Leonard, Vita Sackville-West, and other members of the Bloomsbury group led her to mistrust the fixed essence of any one object of desire. She used her experimental fiction to explore this suspicion of signification itself, i.e. the confession mode in sexology, which would attest to the confession, the act to reliably signify an essential essence, an immutable trajectory of desire onto one type, from one type in a restrictively taxonomic system of classification. Now, at the time Woolf was writing Jacob's Room, at least by 1920, bisexuality was the most revised section of Freud's 3 essays, and it wrote conceptual chaos in Havelock Ellis's Studies in the Psychology of Sex. Both Freud simultaneously attested to his mentor Fleece that bisexuality was, quote, the missing piece, yet also that the concept of bisexuality embarrasses all his inquiries into the subject. Now, the premise of my research examines Woolf's inception of an experimental aesthetic, quote, without scaffolding, that seems not only unafraid of the sexological anxiety about the classification of the bisexual subject, or what Woolf described as molds in Jacob's Room, but actually Woolf was receptive to the potential of sexological notions of bisexuality to rupture mononormative assumptions. That male and female characters desire Jacob, and that Jacob's sexuality is never known or fixed, undercut any systems of sexological classification, or, as Woolf would have it, quote, gig-lamped, symmetrically arranged, and instead shower the reader with atoms from all sides of a bisexual mode of polymorphous perversity, as the sexological language would describe it. What I'm arguing here is that Jacob elicits both opposite and same-sex eroticism because Woolf allows him to become an object of desire for both female and male characters. From Florinda to Bomini. In the interest of time, I want to examine a very short moment of being in the novel that involved 2 dancers who desire Jacob and claim him to be the most beautiful creature that they have ever seen. In doing so, Woolf nestles the sexological conceptions of normal and the abnormal side by side amongst, quote, men, women, close quote. On the one hand, we are told by the narrator that there are difficulties for the observer or analyst when they start, quote, tunneling into the complexity of things, close quote, and immerse themselves in the uncertainty of the, quote, dark labyrinth of human desire, where, quote, 2,000 hearts are submerged in the chaos of semi-darkness. The narrator confesses that mononormative signifiers of an essential essence can create certainty and eliminate doubt from the process of diagnosing types and groups. And that's what the quote I've put on the PowerPoint there indicates. In short, the observer is choked with observations, choked being quite an operative word in this context, only to prevent us from being submerged by chaos. Nature and society between them have arranged a system of classification, which is simplicity itself. You can almost note the scathing irony that kind of like underpins Woolf's tone in that passage. The moulds are filled nightly. There is no need to distinguish the details, which I read as incredibly sarcastic, but the difficulty remains. One has to choose. That scene is followed by a very odd, strange scene at Cambridge at a party when, quote, Jacob could not dance. He stood against the wall smoking a pipe. We think, said 2 of the dancers, breaking up from the rest and bowing profoundly before him, that you are the most beautiful man we have ever seen. After this odd, incongruous scene, Florinda is embraced by Jacob as with, quote, one hand with which he held her, which is then preceded by an intimate moment in which Jacob walks arm in arm with Timmy Durrant in the early hours of the next morning as they discuss having known, quote, every sin, every passion and joy. Therefore, it's my contention that the narrator of Jacob's Room embodies the uncertainty and doubt that beset the sexologist, who found that bisexuality made it difficult to, quote, sum people up in mononormative moulds. Woolf does this to allude to the ghostly other, in Stephen Engelide's words, that was the bisexual subject in sexology, embarrassing their queries as it did. What we are forced as readers to confront is to ask to question the validity of a narrator come sexologist who would ascribe an almost arrogant sense of certainty to a subject whose desires are polymorphous. Woolf asks us, sorry, 1 second. Woolf asks us to question not the subject, but the person who is presenting that subject to us as readers. By extension, we are asked to reflect on which aspects of Jacob's sexuality are only partially represented. In Woolf's wording, in her essay on modern fiction, the doubt-ridden narration in Jacob's room does not render intelligible the, quote, myriad sexual impressions which come from all sides, an incessant shower of innumerable atoms. Along this line and within this context, Barry Morgenstern, in The Self-Conscious Narrator in Jacob's Room, says that one of the focuses of Woolf's novel are their narrators and the narrative commentary. Morgenstern emphasizes Woolf's foregrounding of the, quote, perceptual filter, through which events, subjective impressions, and interior thoughts are relayed and represented to readers. In Jacob's Room, the subject is a 25-year-old man and the narrator is a 35-year-old woman who informs the readers that 10 years seniority and a difference in sex creates an identificatory chasm between herself and Jacob, her subject. We therefore cannot help but question the suitability of the selected narrator to reliably report realities, which mirrors the skepticism Woolf had towards Freudian fiction, which she recognized as a truth that has been mediated by the perceptual filter of the psychoanalyst. It is therefore ironic that Jacob's favourite writer is Henry Fielding, who wrote Tom Jones, which is a text that advanced a system of coherent narrative threads that provided readers back then a constantly reliable mode of interpretation that was intelligible, accessible, and, through a contemporary gaze, quite over-descriptive, with very little left to inference. The narrator in Tom Jones provides information for the reader, whereas in Jacob's Room, the opinions of the narrator are imbricated within both external events and Jacob's thoughts as he shares his desire to travel to Italy and embrace the Italian dust about his shoes. The older female narrator even offers unsolicited invitations to a debate, as if a response was expected by the open question that, who shall deny that in these respects any woman is nicer than a man? The narrator is portrayed as someone who seems unreceptive to the temporal and discursive limits of the Bildungsroman, as she often elaborates, muses, and reflects on her own ambitions, such as the wayward monologue that tells us what she should like to get out amongst the fields and sit down and hear the grasshoppers. She even goes as far as to undercut Jacob's passions for Greek culture by asserting that, quote, it is absurd. She also seems to advocate the rigid taxonomy of sexology's system of classifications, as she reduces experiences, desires, and affectivity to a very binarized paradigm whereby, quote, either we are men or we are women, either we are cold or we are sentimental, either we are young or we are growing old. However, much like the revisions that sexologists make when considering bisexuality, the narrator seems to double back and retroactively redefine the nature of desire as she admits, quote, blame it or praise it. There is no denying the wild horse in us, to gallop intemperately. As for men and women, let them go hang. There is no getting over the fact that this desire seizes us pretty often. And for me, the key words here are men and women, which references her previous version of mutually exclusive categories that she now realizes to be fluid, quote, getting over the fact, close quote, which means she has changed the nature of reality. And this desire, which is wild, like a free-running horse, of course, unless, of course, it is ridden in straight lines. The wild horse is actually a suitable metaphor for the presence of bisexuality in sexology. And in chapter 12, when Jacob is visiting Greece, two phrases within this context really stood out for me as I researched modernist notions of bisexuality. Firstly, was the description of, quote, the most incongruous assortment, close quote, and other significant wording was the description that for Jacob, quote, no form can be set on his sensations, close quote. I hope that I have demonstrated the significance of this in a novel that imitates, ironically, the Bildungsroman, which is the development of the artist spiritually, sexually, and socially, that by its very definition tends to depict the psychosexual development of its protagonist. In the same moment in chapter 12, Jacob, we are told, is, quote, saluted by citizens of both sexes. And I would ask, why are we told this? Similarly, why we are not told explicitly the genders of the dancers previously mentioned at Cambridge, who proclaimed that Jacob was the most beautiful creature that they had ever laid eyes upon. Furthermore, in a previous chapter, Jacob sits naked, having, quote, undressed, apparently to bathe, close quote, as Timmy Durrant, his male friend at Cambridge, scribes, quote, scientific observations in his notepad. The narrator makes no effort to render anything concrete, rational, or definite for us, with either Timmy, Richard Bomany, Florinda, or Claire Durrant. In a novel where the narrator over-explains and over-emphasizes how, quote, certain things are, that there is no doubt about events, why are we, as readers, not presented with sexual certainties and ontological fixities that would give us both a category of sexual identity and therefore an explicit representation of sexuality? Arguably, this could be to avoid scandal, but considering Orlando's content later in 1928, I would consider this to be an unlikely reservation on Woolf's part. Instead, what I propose here is that my reading, at least, of Jacob's Room shows Woolf's own burgeoning bisexual subjectivity that coincided with her first forays into the experimental narrative method, which in turn was in sync with the conceptual chaos that the uncategorizable state of bisexuality caused in the new science of sexuality. I would assert that this, at the very least, has at least a minor influence on both on the form of both Jacob's interactions with, quote, both men and women, close quote, as well as influence in the uncertainty and doubt that is imbued within the novel, that refuses to provide either a reliable or even a confident narrator. And in conclusion, no, let's keep it short. What I find interesting is that Woolf's development of her experimental technique, quote, without scaffolding, close quote, seems to foreground the interpretive strategies of the minor characters and the readers in Jacob's Room. We are invited to recognise the process of interpreting signifiers as indicators of a coherent and essential sexual self. But, as Woolf writes, it is no good trying to sum people up. And in this light, the fact that bisexuality was never really given serious consideration during sexological publications, and hence not latched on by cultures, newspapers, or even writers, that in itself made it especially interesting for Woolf, who was very sceptical about conflating desire, object, with an identity, which in and of themselves are essentially monosexual molds. And just to close, it is worth reflecting on chapter 3, as Mrs. Norman says, as she observes an attempt to classify young Jacob travelling as he is to Cambridge. It is, quote, all interpretation, close quote, and there is no use trying to sum people up. In Woolf's diary, she reflected that a plunge into deep waters, which is a little alarming, but full of interest. And the same was true of bisexuality. It was unstable, and it had the ability to unwrite a lot of sexological progress. It needed to wait outside the room, so to speak. Woolf said that the void, the polymorphous depths that, quote, one goes down into the well and nothing protects one from the assault of truth, close quote, which is more uncomfortable than our neat taxonomic categories that purport to show us everything in their entirety through totalizing paradigms that rest on binary oppositions, such as, to quote Helen Sixier's phrasing in Sorties, man/woman, sun/moon, straight/gay. And it is my assertion that without the conceptual chaos of bisexuality in sexology that intersected with Woolf's own bisexual desire, the experimental aesthetic of Jacob's Room would not be what it is, formless, doubtful, uncertain, and severely resisting any form of fixity. We constantly, persistently question the narrator's priorities. We re-examine their attribution of significance, their hierarchies of importance, prior knowledge and intention, which version of Jacob is presented to us. Is it same sex? Is it opposite sex desire? Well, and this representations of reality, we are encouraged to focus on the one diagnosing and defining, rather than the subject who is taxonomized through mononormative categorizations. Jacob's Room, therefore, is a succession of vignettes of perspectival imagery and constructions of character that are perpetually in media res. As a reader, that means in and amongst, in the middle of everything. As a reader, we are always arriving after the exposition and development. Our astonishing gift for illusion, it's like what we want, it's like we almost want to meet the narrators and not Jacob. As Woolf says, Jacob's sexuality and the desire that he elicits in others is at once momentary and astonishingly intimate, to be displayed before the eyes of the foreigner. And just to wrap up, I guess it is worth reflecting on why this is relevant in 2022, which is obviously 100 years after the publication of Jacob's Room. And Christopher James, who was a queer theorist, in an article called Denying Complexity, wrote, quote, "Must bisexuality remain a footnote?" And it made me reflect that, you know, Woolf, in the same way that a lot of queer theorists do, lets doubt be celebrated as a stepping stone to self-exploration of sexuality. And perhaps we need to be comfortable with the uncertainty and resist the paranoia of a coherent cis and heteronormative coherence. Even Woolf's forays into the potential of bisexuality to rupture the zero-sum modes of totalizing identities can foster and cultivate our perception of how we perceive singular object desire. These rigid and, just to close with a quote from Joseph Bristow, Eve Sedgwick said, "The chronic, now endemic crisis of homo/heterosexual identity was echoed by Joseph Bristow, who encourages to be skeptical of, quote, the precarious break between homo and hetero that dominate culture and still to keep us as distinct as possible." And that is the end. Thank you very much.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Chris. Really fascinating paper, and I like that you have brought bisexuality out of being a footnote, something for us to think about more centrally there in Jacob's Room. Thank you for that. I think you're still sharing your screen. If you want to just click the little square in the middle of the box. We've still got your, can you see there's a square in the middle of the bar with a cross in it? That's the one, you've got it. Fantastic. Thank you. Great. So we're now on to our third speaker, Vara Neverow. Hi, Vara. And I will try and not make a mess of sharing your slides while I'm introducing you. I'll do my best here. Hopefully people can see those.
I can see them.
You can see them. Fantastic. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our third and final speaker, Vara Neverow, who, now I've shared my slides and I've realised I can't see my own notes. Now that was foolish, wasn't it?
See, that's why I asked you to do it.
I made a mistake. Hang on, bear with me a second while I sort myself out. I'm trying to be too clever. And I couldn't do it. So Vara is Professor of English and Women's and Gender Studies at Southern Connecticut State University. Her scholarship focuses primarily on Virginia Woolf. And the contribution to Woolf studies is huge. She organised the second annual conference on Virginia Woolf held in 1992, served as president of the International Virginia Woolf Society for 2 terms. She has produced a large amount of scholarship on Woolf herself, also as the editor of the Virginia Woolf Miscellany since 2003. Her scholarly work on Woolf includes the co-edited collections Virginia Woolf 21st Century Approaches, Virginia Woolf Critical and Primary Sources, and the Edinburgh Companion to Virginia Woolf and Contemporary Global Literature. And what Vara's going to be doing for her paper now, which is going to be really fascinating and interesting, I think, for us following those two first presentations, is Tracing Patterns in the Critical Reception of Jacob's Room from 1922 to 2022. And now I will try and share the slides again, and let me know as you want me to flick through those, Vara, whenever you're ready.
Thank you so much. It's delightful to have this opportunity to share ideas, and I'm very grateful to be part of it. So the title of this is Tracing Patterns in the Critical Reception of Jacob's Room from 1922 to 2022, and I think clicking would be fine. The presentation traces the way that the reception has shifted from one moment or perspective over the years and the decades. The selected critical perspectives form here a collage of random patterns that began in 1922 with the first reviews of the novel, many of which can be accessed in Robin and Majumdar and Alan McLaurin's Virginia Woolf Critical Heritage. The perspectives were mixed, but only a few of the initial ones were scathing, and the novel garnered a great degree of respect and engagement from Woolf's contemporaries, despite or because of its experimental approach. However, this initial positive reception did fade over the next 50 years. Drawing on a previous presentation, I will engage with Winifred Holtby's chapter devoted to Jacob's Room in her 1932 critical biography of Woolf, James Hafley's chapter on Jacob's Room, or section of a chapter that involves Jacob's Room, in his 1952 dissertation, later published in 1954 as The Glass Roof, Virginia Woolf as Novelist, and Edward L. Bishop's 1992 article, The Subject in Jacob's Room, and we'll finally discuss briefly Urmila Seshagari's introduction and notes to the 2022 second edition of Oxford World's Classics edition of Jacob's Room, first edited by Kate Flint in 1992. Holtby titles her chapter on Jacob's Room Cinematograph. Oh, I have a difficulty saying that word. Cinematograph, success. And while pairing Jacob's Room with The Voyage Out as narratives of premature death, she states that almost any page in the book could be transferred straight to a film. The movie style of narration relies mainly on external evidence of emotions, and Holtby highlights multiple filmic techniques in the novel, describing how in the first pages that the camera swings round to photograph the entire bay, yacht, and lighthouse quivering through Mrs. Flanders' tears, and flashes back to indicate a blot spreading over the writing paper. Later in Woolf's depiction of Cambridge as pictures, Holtby refers to these images that Woolf creates as radiant. And in a witty and rather cunning passage, Holtby observes that Mrs. Flanders, who gelded Topaz the orange cat, would also, quote, probably have derived satisfaction from her vicarious gelding of Mr. Floyd, the man with red hair who had proposed to her and who had given the cat to one of her boys. With the same sense of humor, which mirrors and validates Woolf's own, Holtby not only praises the portrayal of the Dons at Cambridge, but also lauds how Florinda is depicted. She is a Chelsea-esque and amateur in her way to work as a prostitute, and who seduced, and this is a quote, the innocent Jacob, ready game for even so casual a huntress. Going further, Holtby observes that Mrs. Woolf, and this is a quote, regards sex with steady and amused comprehension, which, for a woman writing in 1922, was an unexpected attitude. As Holtby observes, Woolf puts sex in its place, while her male modernist contemporaries think sincerely that, quote, sex is serious, with sex in title case. Holtby concludes her discussion of the novel by tagging the cruelty, and that's a quote, followed by a quote. The crab tries to escape from the bucket. Kind Mrs. Flanders smiles at Topaz. Jacob neglects Clara. Florinda has a baby by the wrong man. Sandra Wentworth Williams is heartless. Jacob dies. This chapter makes no references to any sources that are scholarly or otherwise, as would be the case in 1932 in a critical biography. Moving on, 20 years later, James Hafley, when he completed his dissertation, writes in the edition that was published by the University of California Press, addresses briefly, but with a very focused approach, to the overview of the structure of the novel, and observes that, quote, it has no plot in the common sense of the term. Further, he states that, quote, the reader never sees Jacob at his work, never sees him in the war, does not know how or when or where he is killed. And indeed, quote, seemingly trivial incidents and, quote, fragments are all that the reader is given. Hafley does quote from several scholars, including J.W. Beach, who sees the novel in a derogatory fashion as feminine and evasive, and compares it to works by Dorothy Richardson, a claim that Hafley himself rejects, since he sees no comparisons between them. Hafley also observes that while Jacob's friends, and the narrator as well, have both their opinions about Jacob and their various desires for him, Jacob himself is unknown. And while the other characters, such as Betty Flanders and Sandra Wentworth Williams's own thoughts, are reported by an omniscient narrator who is, quote, somewhere behind the immediate narrator, the immediate narrator herself never describes Jacob's own perspectives. Hafley finds this technique of having two narrators very awkward and claims that, quote, the result is an unresolved disparity in point of view. And as a consequence, he argues that the novel is indeed, quote, not a completely accomplished work of art. By integrating several scholars and intermittently mentioning the theories of another word is going to tangle me up here. We'll just say Bergenson's thinking, Hafley takes Jacob's Room to a more scholarly level than Holtby does in her critical biography. And this is one of the traces that becomes more and more evident as the scholars move in and are much more involved in, if you will, the evolution of critical theory. Thus, The Subject in Jacob's Room by Edward L. Bishop, who is truly an expert in the study of Jacob's Room, having transcribed the holograph held in the Berg collection, is a more sophisticated, astute, multifaceted, and polished approach than either Holtby's or Hafley's, and is significantly longer than either of those. And it cannot be discussed in any great depth due to the complexity. However, I have tagged certain elements that are well worth mentioning. The article begins with a philosophical witticism. Hey, you there, comes the call from Althusser's famous anecdote of interpolation and the individual thus hailed turns around and becomes a subject. Becomes a subject because he recognizes that the call is for him, because individuals are always already subjects. And this is a quote from Ideology. Bishop points out that Archer's call, Jacob, Jacob, is a prime example of Althusser's theory and asserts that, quote, Woolf is not representing character, and character is italicized, but instead is, quote, exploring the construction and representation of the subject. He suggests that Jacob is a type-like individual who both represents his class but also transcends his class status as an educated young man. And furthermore, Bishop suggests that Woolf has actually deliberately uncreated Jacob. Contrasting the techniques of Jacob's Room with those of James Joyce's Ulysses situates Woolf's strategy of culling not only the, quote, internal dialogue, but even, quote, dialogue between characters. And in a later section of the article, Bishop alerts the reader that Flanders tells the readership that Jacob is foredoomed. He is dead before he is born into the text, his patronymic already a citation from the text of the First World War. In one key passage, Bishop asserts that not only does Woolf want to avoid inevitably compromising situation of trying to denounce war while celebrating individual heroics, she also wants to show that war is merely the logical outcome of a system. And in his closing remarks, Bishop states that, quote, the publication of Jacob's Room represents a subversion of what Woolf called the patriarchal machinery, noting that Woolf, quote, contests the interpolations of parent, parliament, and the publishing industry, using her power to show how that system creates subjects who march so dutifully, so inevitably into war. He advocates for the counterpoint that the novel provides. Quote, in all its aspects, from its subject, Flanders, at once character and ghost, to the material conditions of its production, it was involved in breaking the mirror, making readers aware of the ideology that interpolated not just the hero of the book, but the readers themselves. Shifting to the present, as far as I can determine, the only scholarly publications released in 2022 that specifically address Jacob's Room in a scholarly fashion are Christopher J. Wells' own article, from which we obviously heard a delightful reading, and published in March 2022. Romela Seshagari's introduction and notes for the second edition of the Oxford World's Classics of Jacob's Room, which I will discuss in greater depth, and the September 2022 Virginia Woolf Bulletin issue that dedicates a section to the centenary of Jacob's Room and includes Stewart and Clark's The Composition History of Jacob's Room, plus a haiku, as well as 5 other contributions. And that actually appears on one of the later slides, and actually will stay, I think, on Saragashi. I'm garbling her name, I'm sorry about that, but we could just quickly go through it when this is coming toward the end. And forthcoming in the miscellany, there will be the 4 essays from the 31st Annual Virginia Woolf Conference plenary on Jacob's Room. So I feel obligated here to swerve to a bit of silliness regarding several iterations of Jacob's Room touted on Amazon, and none of them are actually listed here, but actually going through just And thank you, Alice. And I just wanted to include this because it's absolutely deranged. There are at least two versions that have been published supposedly this year. One claims to be an annotated classic edition, and that one is worth leaving up. And thank you very much, because that includes all of the contributions to that issue of the bulletin. One claims to be an annotated classic edition, and both of them offer peculiar observations in the blurbs. The promotional statement for one edition states temptingly, "If you are in the mood for a good old-fashioned love story, look no further than Jacob's Room by Virginia Woolf." Curiously, the same volume also provides a detailed 19th century historical outline for a novel that covers 5 or so years, starting in the 1890s and ending perhaps in the late autumn of 1914, when suddenly all the leaves seem to raise themselves in the final chapter, when Bonamy and Mrs. Flanders are in Jacob's flat. The even more peculiar, so-called annotated edition offers various front matter, including a biography of Virginia Woolf that begins with the statement, "In 1878, Leslie Stephen and Julia Jackson Duckworth married, which was the second one marriage for each of them. They gave birth to Adeline Virginia Stephen 4 years later. Virginia became the 0.33 in their 4 kids. Leslie Stephen commenced his career as a priest." And we'll just stop there with an emoji of laughing so hard that one starts to cry. In her 32-page long introduction, Sexology is very appropriate and focused in positioning Jacob's Room in the context with literary and historical elements. One of her most evocative moments, and actually, Alice, if you wanted to go back to Sexology, that would probably be useful. And thank you. This is why I didn't want to do it myself. One of her most evocative moments is evident when she quotes the narrator's bitterly plaintive reference to the, quote, "simple young man at Cambridge who would, but there is no need to think of them grown old," and then refers to the many artists over the centuries who have died relatively young, though only one of those, by the way, is mentioned, who was a woman, and it's Jane Austen. Another particularly engaging passage is Sexology's focus on the ways that Woolf challenges modernist Hellenism. That's a quote, interweaving Greek elements into multiple layers of the novel. And she refers not only to a range of Woolf's that intersects with Jacob's Room, but also refers to numerous other authors' work, perhaps as a strategy to inform a readership that is not yet familiar with multiple modernist writers, whom they may not even be aware of. A particular passage that I like in the introduction is Sexology's quote of Woolf's own statement that Jacob's Room was, quote, "my own favorite, the only one I can sometimes read a page of without disgust." I want to tag Oxford's promotional statement that the volume offers new explanatory endnotes for the 21st century reader, including historical and literary references, geographical sites, terms that have passed out of common usage, and connections to Woolf's other writings. Clearly, the small, affordable, and relatively concise volume is intended for a readership that includes college students and common readers rather than passionate scholars. But calibrating what the reader is likely not to know is a serious challenge and a gamble. And Sexology struggles with it in the same ways that all the previous editors have. Sexology, in her first entry, perhaps inevitably opts to explain the underlying significance of Betty Flanders' married name. We do not know her birth name. The name evokes the historical contexts of Flanders Fields and Major John McCrae's poem, as well as mentioning the symbolic meaning of poppies. The second entry provides an overview of Scarborough, a useful description for a general reader. The reference to, quote, early closing day, an entry from page 5 in the novel, seems to be provided for USian readers, since this term is still used occasionally in the UK, and this illustrates a problem that any reader must confront. Who is the readership? Does it matter, in this case, if the editor of a British publication is, in fact, USian? And even more problematically, what if the USian editor actually misinterprets British usages or terms? In my own Harcourt edition of Jacob's Room, I erroneously added "the" to Waterloo Bridge. Oops. Returning to Seshagari's notes, a reference to page 16 in the novel tags the Gelb paths, which is a very important moment in the discussion of Jacob's Room, and glosses the term furze bush, and then links the reference also to a description of the fritillary butterfly with a detailed description of other butterflies and moths that appear in the novel. But alas, there are no page numbers in that citation. And here are some other questions about what should or could or might not be appropriate for notes. Do the universities of Cambridge and Oxford require a reference? They are, in fact, referenced on page 156. Do the terms Don, went down, and Manchester deserve such close attention? Cheese pairing, which appears on the same page, may indeed be obscure for some readers. But leaping to a citation from page 115 in the novel, noted on page 174, does Napoleon really need to be identified? And perhaps so, as history wanes. Without a doubt, the explanation of the Kodak camera is essential for a majority of readers, since it actually explains the origin of that particular device. Of course, such assessments must ultimately devolve on the individual reader, since each of us sees the text in a different way. So, to sum up, I have traced random but reverberating patterns in this talk, though not as randomly as the patterns of the novel itself. And I hope that these fleeting references to the evolving reception and interpretations of Jacob's Room will spark further interest in Woolf's extraordinary third novel, which we celebrate today.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Vara.
Thank you.
Taking us through a whole range of different kind of ways in which the novel has been read over that last century, and also taking us to the point of thinking about how we access that text today and what's significant there in terms of editorship and audience. Thank you. 3 brilliant papers. This is the moment when I ask us all to sort of clap in our individual rooms, but we are we are all clapping, the 3 of you, and to open it out now, I hope, to some questions, some responses. There is a facility to raise your hand if you'd like to be invited to unmute and speak. But I think I'm going to ask first of all if Rachel Crossland would like to come in with some first kind of responses and thoughts and maybe questions, and then we'll open it up more. Of course, feel free to use the chat as well if people would like to.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Alice, and thank you to all 3 of our wonderful speakers. And I mean, this is something that Alice and I have been talking, or rather messaging about, for months now, in the middle of the night as we waited for our children to go to sleep. And it's so wonderful to have it kind of finally come to life. And I think it's fair to say it's completely exceeded all our expectations. So thank you, all of you, and thank you everyone for coming. Vara, just thinking about this kind of annotation issue and wondering if, you know, the further we get away from publication, the longer and longer perhaps the explanatory notes section will get, until we've got these kind of unwieldy volumes. But really, I just want to say thank you so much. We've had 3 such rich and varied papers, and with Vara as well, talking about other papers dealing with this novel. I think it really gives us a sense of how extraordinary this book is and how many different ways there are of responding to it and approaching it. And I mean, it's a brilliant book, a fascinating book, a difficult book, I think it's fair to say. And we can come at it in so many different ways. So, I mean, I guess here we are at this moment of the centenary, so it makes sense for us to be looking back and thinking about different approaches in the way that Vara has done today. But both Charlotte and Chris in their talks touched a little bit on why it might be that you're coming to this novel in the particular ways you are at this moment. And I wondered if maybe we could explore that a little bit more before we open out to wider conversation. You know, that's part of our thinking behind this project, is to really kind of focus not just on the novel, but what it means to read the book now. So maybe Chris and Charlotte, and then Vara, thinking about, you know, how do we think about this novel 100 years on, and what difference does that make?
Who'd like to go first?
I'll go first if you can.
Great, Chris.
Yeah. I think well, I discovered Jacob's Room after being kind of immersed in queer theory and the landscape of queer, you know, all the politics of identity and stuff, and all the sort of, you know, we're post Judith Butler, post Lee Sedgwick, and we kind of, you know, post 1990s sort of peak of bisexual theory and sociological studies. And for me, I was just fascinated by how relevant and how queer the text is now, looking at it 100 years later. And it's kind of, I was a bit straight. I haven't really found a lot of queer responses to Jacob's Room. And I think that it's just, I just read it as a really queer text. It's deconstructive. It disassembles any notion of a coherent self. And I think it's very relevant 100 years later. Yeah, that's all I have to say on that.
Great,
So,
Chris. Vara, do you want to
Yeah.
come in?
And I think I would just like to add to what Chris said. I mean, I've been familiar with this novel probably for longer than Chris has, and I thought that it was so extraordinarily queer that it's almost a mapping of Woolf's own, obviously, relationships within Bloomsbury. Very clearly, Bonamy is Lytton Strachey, and he knew it. And she's also drawing on D.H. Lawrence's scene in Women in Love, which is actually Men in Love, where two men are naked and struggling in front of a fireplace, but this one actually has a witness, which is hilarious. The elderly woman who is cleaning Bonamy's flat, and it's just like Woolf is constantly exposing us as readers to queerness.
Yeah.
And the one of the things that Holtby claims is that, in terms of queerness, that Florinda, who has no last name, hilariously, because women don't really have last names, only patriarchal names, is that it's probably Jacob's child, and she's marrying Nick, and actually she is going to bear his child, and that probably Sarah also conceived Jacob's child. And it's just like queer in giant flashing neon transgression. And this has been what I've always found fascinating in Jacob's Room. So thank you, Chris, for agreeing with me.
Can I jump back in? Is that all right? Yeah. I completely agree with everything that's just been said. Like that neon sign, it's just, it's so immediately obvious now, but perhaps it wasn't. I'm not overly familiar with the history of the criticism or the responses to the reviewers, but I remember when I was researching my article, like a lot of the responses were like frustration over a lack of coherence or an assemblage of like polymorphous multiplicity of expressions and stuff. And I think that was something that was noted in reviewers 100 years ago, and it's only now where we kind of retroactively applying the tools of queer theory to kind of say, oh, is this what she meant? And it is astounding that the way that this narrative emerged at a time when, you know, queer modernism has been written about by a lot of different people, but it's insane that it wasn't kind of picked up on at the time, I guess. But I think now there's more to be had from it. I don't know if Vara agrees, but
Charlotte, would you like to come in maybe and say a little bit about what you what drew you to this novel, how you see we read it 100 years after its first publication?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll answer Rachel's question, then I actually have something to say to Chris as well.
Oh no.
So for me, it's really just an evolution in feminism that sort of brought me back to looking at motherhood in a different way through all of Woolf's works, not just Jacob's Room. But I think that now that we can look at sort of the multiplicity of women's lives and women's expression, we can really come to look at motherhood in an academic way rather than kind of having to suppress images of mothers and not talk about motherhood, because perhaps in second wave feminism, motherhood was something that was too difficult to kind of embrace whilst also being feminist. And I think there's been a long time where Woolf's image of the angel in the room has sort of taken over the conversation of motherhood in her work. So that's where I come back to the novel. But I wondered, just completely aside, whether Chris had read any of Otto Weininger's work in relation to Woolf, because I think he's really fascinating. And I think it's Jesse Woolf talks about how, well, I think he's talking about Mrs. Dalloway, and he's saying that it encompasses Weininger's theory of permanent bisexuality or something like that. But he's really fascinating. He's got this idea of alternating gender, alternating sexuality, and Beta Sackville-West was obsessed with him, and she had a very heavily annotated copy of his book. And in the New Statesman article that Desmond McCarthy wrote, the Our Women review, he also reviews Weininger's book, which is really interesting. And I think it might be worth, if you haven't ever read it, having a look at it, because I think it's quite relevant and it's really interesting.
Yes, I will. Is it Sex and Character? Is it
Yes,
that one?
That's right.
Yeah. That text is absolutely insane. That is it is insane. It's like everyone is bi, but nobody is bi, but everyone is. And then Freud kind of adopts that later on, and he goes, everyone is bisexual, but nobody is at any point in time. But it's only a phase, but it isn't. And it's just like what is it? Yeah. No.
Knew each other.
All right. Yeah.
It sounds like we're back to formless and doubtful again in some way. I wonder whether this would be a good point to open it up and ask if anybody else has got some questions they'd like to